All right. Well, welcome. I have the pleasure to chat with John Mark Krenkel, who is our first interview of our oral history project, part of the Jacktown Packer archive. And John, before we start, today is Saturday, November 6th, I believe. And I just want to check in and make sure I have permission to record and archive this interview today.
Yes, you do.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, welcome. How are you?
I'm fine. Pretty morning.
Good. Good. And you have a shirt on. Would you like to tell us about that so we can all enjoy it?
I'm assuming virtually anybody who sees this shirt will know what Ricky's Cafe is, but Hanover, Kansas, virtually every year from 1977 to 1997.
96. 96. Great. Great. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and jump right in? So the first question I have for you will just simply be how did all this start for you? Basically, what years were you involved in Jacktown, either physically or in a supportive role? What was your role? Because there's probably half of the Packers who've never met you before and do not know what an integral part of the trip you played. And then where you live now. So just a brief intro about yourself.
Well, you can probably not see out the window, but I live in Dallas, Oregon, but headed to the ocean. I'm 74 and almost 75 years old at this point, and hope to pack with the Packers again someday. I still have my fantasies, which is kind of where it all starts. It started because I'd been heading to Colorado from Michigan, as I taught in Michigan for a few years before 76, and was telling my students, as I often did in class when I talked about things other than what I was supposed to be talking about how much I love Colorado. Oh, it was the John Denver years, and there, a lot of my students jumped on that and said, well, we'd love to do that. And I said, well, why don't we all do it together? And they said, okay, why don't you see that happen? So as you'll learn later in these interviews, several students, Amy Johnson, Rod Sheely, Ellen Snyder, Mark Burdick, Greg Brown, a few others, got excited and they pushed me. And over the year, we stumbled our way through how to get it going, how to get a bus, how to get a rack on top of the bus, which you all know so well. Greg Brown and shop classes did that. Tried fundraisers, found out that they don't pay for the time you put in. Go get a job, you make a lot more money towards the trip. And kept the price trip really low nonetheless. I think it was $250 the first trip. Never took a salary. From that first trip, we bought the backpacks, the Alpenlight packs, the Eureka tents, the Space stoves, all those items that we supplied over the years. That money, the purchase of those items came from the first trip, plus all the expenditures of the trip itself came out of that first $250 per times 35 students. And then somehow we got on the bus on the morning of whatever it was in June 1977 and ended up in Colorado.
Talk a little bit about the academic portion. Like, how is it that piece came about? And I'm sure from an administrative standpoint, that was probably one way you had to sell this, right? So how did the credit for the class come about? And how did the curriculum come together?
I think you're right. I think it wasn't I think our principal, George Kiesel, would have approved the trip just because he loved the idea and he would accept virtually anything that was creative and good for students. But it was my own personal philosophy. If you're going to offer it as a school program, you need to find some way to legitimize it on the transcript. You can't just put it down there backpacking in Colorado and expect it to have any meaning. But if you put down field studies, history and ecology of the American West, and you meet every Wednesday night for 6 months, and I don't know if it's every Wednesday, but with holiday breaks, and that, again, it was personal philosophy that I like to keep everything I do with schools as as legitimately academic as I could. And I went on transcripts that way with grades and all that. And we had real assignments, books to read and lectures to attend and journals to keep and so on.
Great. So tell me this. I mean, you mentioned the 70s and the era of John Denver. Had you ever heard of any other educators doing a similar trip? Like, were you inspired by something you had seen or observed or heard about or read about in your own studies? Or did you think of this all on your own? Like, where did the inspiration come from?
Well, I was aware of Outward Bound. It was a pretty big deal in the 70s, and I don't know if I learned about Knowles then or a little bit later. I do think I camped up in the Medicine Bow Range in southern Wyoming once with my sons and Susie, and there might have been somebody I can't remember if it was a small group or if it's another teacher who's doing something. There's something going on there that inspired me to think we could do this. It was nothing approaching the magnitude of what we were doing, but it did remind me that there were possibilities. But no, other than that, it was pretty much invented whole cloth. And the whole Jacktown Packers was, I mean, at some point I became aware of that we were in some ways trying to do something similar to what Outward Bound was doing, but I never wanted a survivalist program or a surviving in the wilderness type program. That was not my idea of how I wanted to organize a trip, but it was pretty much whole cloth. We invented it.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any colleagues try to replicate Jacktown? No? Okay,
No.
That surprises me.
It was a disappointment to me that none of my colleagues at Parkside ever got interested in continuing the program. If it weren't for Al, and then later on Heather and Denny, becoming central characters or the moving characters in the Packers, I doubt it would have gone beyond 82.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But nobody at Parkside, nobody at Jackson High even that I know of.
Are you surprised then with that it went on for 20 years?
That's a tough question. And with hindsight, no, yes and no. I mean, I'm surprised because I had so many programs I tried to develop over the years that died when I disappeared. But knowing Al Ferry, see, this is the other half of the hindsight. Knowing Al Ferry, I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah.
He doesn't like me to say this, but he was if it weren't for him, the Packers would never have become much more than it was in 78. But with Al coming in 79, and now I knew I had somebody who would handle the logistics, the nuts and bolts. Not that we handle logistics together, but the nuts and bolts of making sure making sure the tents, and Al making sure the tents were repaired and the stoves were functioning and going year to year, and making sure that things were running well, because that's not my forte. I like to create them. I like to get things going. I like to set the model, but I need somebody else to make it work, in an ongoing way.
Yeah, makes sense. And Al definitely is a workhorse, right? I mean, he's very good with that, so that makes sense. Perfect. You guys were a good team.
I think we were about as good as it gets.
Yeah. So you started in 77. When was your last
Let me also interject. I don't need to leave out Henry Toll. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I shouldn't leave out Henry Toll and Gary and Jeanette and Jim, but Henry Toll was always there, always supporting me, always at my right hand, being willing to back me on what I was doing. Even when I gave him holy hell, I'm surprised he didn't walk out on me several times for the way I treated him. But without that kind of support among my colleagues as well as my students, it could have fallen apart.
And how did he get involved? And was he at Parkside as well?
Yes, off and on, but yes, he was there. that first couple of years, and he was a social studies teaching colleague who had been to Philmont with Boy Scouts and had some background in that area, and had a real definite interest in this type of activity in mountains and wilderness in the West and so on. So yeah, he was a critical part of a person I could throw ideas against, and there was nobody else. I mean, every other idea that because there were a lot of things I'm talking about I couldn't deal with students. It was how stuff had to bounce around inside my head unless Henry was there to let it out every once in a while.
Mm-hmm. So I think I recall from earlier conversations you and I've had that he was very interested in the history, obviously, which would make sense. He was a social studies teacher. So did his expertise and interest impact the choices that you made about where you went and what you did on the trip?
Yes and no again. I'm not a black and white person. It's very few things in the world are all right or all wrong. In this case, yes and no. I mean, I probably had as much knowledge of the West and places in the West as he did or more. So places like Bent's Old Fort or the Santa Fe Trail or the Oregon Trail ruts or Fort Laramie, to use a few examples. Those are areas I'd been traveling for a decade by the time the Packers started, from the time I moved west, and well, not decade, but 8 years since the time I moved west in 71 to Kansas. And I'd been traveling back roads and so on. And I knew in Scotts State Park and Quivira, I knew those things. But what Henry brought into that to make it more meaningful for students was Henry loved to immerse himself in those experiences. He loved to get in with the blacksmith or the baker or whatever, the candlestick maker, and do stuff. And that wasn't my way of doing history. One time through, fine, I've seen it, done it. So now I'm going to digress, Lisa, just briefly here. But one of the times he got upset with me was when we were at Old Fort Laramie in Guernsey, and I'd been there, a couple times, and I'd seen it. So I found that I was more interested in wading across the Laramie River and up onto a bluff and taking pictures of the fort from up above, looking through Yucca for, a creative photo picture. We may have some of those in the shows eventually. And Henry's in there, and on one time I actually went to sleep on the parade grounds because I was tired and bored. But Henry's saying, you can't do this in front of the students. It's sending the wrong message. And he was not real happy with me that day. So there, I digress.
So that brings me to another question. I think I know the answer to it, but I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit. But if you had to create a mission statement, or what we now call a strategic plan, or what you wanted students to experience, feel, achieve, accomplish, what do you think in those early years was the goal of the trip ultimately?
Never did a mission statement for the trip before. This is the first one. Kind of late, huh? I never did lesson plans either. That's true. It's a complicated answer. But mission statements should never be just one simple, soundbite, right? I wanted a number of things. I wanted students to have fun and love the West and love the mountains and love. I mean, it's a really profound, deep, soulful kind of thing that you understand. You know what I'm talking about. I wanted to give them a chance to they already intuited that. They knew they would get that feeling. The example I always give is Mark Burdick when we first drove into the mountains, and I've said this in the Zoom sessions, and the tears rolling down his cheeks because he'd never been west of the Mississippi, and now we're in the mountains. The tears. He's standing in the front door of the bus with the door open as we bounce up to Rock Creek. That's what I wanted to create, and I've always thought of Mark in that moment as a sign that there's a good chance this trip would succeed.
Yeah.
But I also wanted to give them an intellectual sense of the importance of, first of all, America, the importance of wilderness, and I was really into wilderness. I still am. The importance of wilderness and that experience to the American credo, to the American mentality, if you will. And I lost the other half of that thought. I do that all the time. But so part of the mission statement then is to develop that soulfulness, but also an intellectual knowledge of these things and the importance of these matters, of this whole part of our collective mentality, our collective consciousness. That's a pretty big statement. That's not very objective.
I didn't ask for objectivity, so no, it's fine.
But I know that the second part came to me, and also a larger general awareness of the critical centrality of environmental health, of the health of the whole environment to our own personal health, not just our subjective our subjective health, but also our objective health. We can't survive without a healthy environment. It will get us all in the end. And I was teaching a book called Limits to Growth at the time, which was a neo-Malthusian book about the dangers of overpopulation, over-industrialization, and over-exploitation of the world's resources. And it all fit in with that. And also writing my own dissertation on that same subject at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And also really into books like Sand County Almanac, or which is the best example I can think of bringing that all together.
Mm-hmm.
You asked, that was a big question. You cheated. You pushed me past my 5 minutes with that question.
I'm just following you.
And I didn't digress at all.
No, you're doing great. Are you ready to move on to something else?
Oh, if you are.
Okay, great. So this is kind of a big question too. So do your best with this. This is one of those abstract, but what does this trip mean to you? So if you were to take Jacktown as an experience of the 10 or so years you were involved, where does that land in your trajectory of your life? Like, is it, one of the top whatevers, but where, and how has it framed you as a person, you as a human, you as a man, you as a father, as an educator? Like, where does this fit in your sensibilities of how you think about yourself?
I'm telling you. Can you write those out for me, please? That was a list of 10 things you just gave me. That was not a simple little question.
How do you feel about this trip in just in your life? Where does it?
To start out with a story, I think it was as recently as yesterday, I told somebody I was talking to here in Oregon that the single greatest creation, other than the procreation of my sons and the creation of a loving relationship and home with my wife, other than those, which are in a different film, I just don't want to leave those out, because to say that the single most important, let me put it in this context, the single most important, I feel the single greatest accomplishment in my professional life was the creation of the Jacktown Packers. Okay. And I always try to be careful, because I didn't do that alone. As I've said several times already today, I did that with students. I did it with Henry Toll and Jeanette and Jim, and with George Kiesel, and all those many people who were helpful in getting us started. And I think in my notes I've said, like Stony Green out at the backpacking store on Horton Road. I don't want to leave those people out. But for me, and that's from a person who also created student trips to Europe that I compare to the Jacktown Packers, although they look totally different. They were created with the same goals and hopes, mission statement, if you were, a similar mission statement in mind, of combining the teaching of academic in the case of the Europe trip's history and art, and in the case of Jacktown Packers history and ecology, combining that with an immersive kind of experience that brings it into your soul, as opposed to being a totally outside your, intellectual. So to answer your question, it was the single I consider it. And I just said to somebody completely just unconnected yesterday, the single greatest creation of my life was the Jacktown Packers. And I feel eternally grateful to those students on that first trip, and the many, many students who followed that year and on through your years, who, as it's shown up in these sessions, these Zoom sessions this past spring, who seem to be saying something similar, that it did for them and with them and to them what I'd hoped it would do. And that kind of gets back to the mission statement of what I wanted to accomplish, and seeing that. And it's surprising the number of people that did seem to have that effect with.
Mm-hmm.
But now I lost the rest of your list of 10 questions, and that were subsumed in that one question.
It was the same question. I just asked it in different ways. So that's all. I'm a teacher too. So kind of in line with all of that, rather than looking at outwardly what you hoped your students to get out of the trip, tell me a bit more about how the trip impacted you and what you learned about yourself.
That's right. That's important. Well, I certainly learned about some of my weaknesses as a person. I probably intuited some of those before. My lack of organizational skills, to some extent, although that may sound surprising, and that even the first year took a lot of organization. I don't know. The weaknesses are hard to talk about. Let's say there are some that I became aware of. But in terms of self-awareness, and this was part of the earlier question too, I became aware of my strengths too. My strengths as a teacher, as a mentor, if you will, maybe even as a parent to some extent, were my ability to create things, create, and mostly in my case, programs, or at least academic or tangentially academic, and things that really, nothing is, as a historian, I believe nothing is ever created out of nothingness. There's always things come together, and we call it an invention, but it's not really an invention. It's a new organization of old things. But also my ability to, at a more emotional level, my ability to make a almost perfect commitment to not just an ideal, but to the people that I'm with, many of whom matter to me. You matter to me, and my commitment to you. And to see you in future years come along, and even though you and I didn't develop a relationship until 20 years later, my ability, and I think most of my students would agree with this, and my friends would agree with this, that when I make a commitment to a person or to an ideal, it's pretty good. It works. That's part of it. I could probably write a book on this one. But
That's great. No, that's perfect.
let me just add to that. Also, my commitment, my own personal commitment to places.
Mm-hmm.
Place being a part of it, only a part of environment, but to places, especially wild places with the Jacktown Packers. And my lifelong, ongoing, forever commitment. That's my number one political issue in the world today, is environmental and specifically wilderness ideals. And that's never ended, never faded, never wavered. It's the one political area where I am unwaveringly committed to those things. My only questions after this past election have been, what's Biden going to do with the Bears ears? What's he going to do with the Escalante? Is he going to reconfirm those wilderness areas as wilderness areas? Or is he going to leave Trump's destruction of those areas intact? That's the only question I was asking the day after the election, or the day after the inauguration. What's he going to do? And he's done it now, so I'm very happy. And the North Slope of Alaska, so not just those areas.
So this might be a chicken and egg question, but indulge me. So kind of along the lines of what you were just talking about. And I recognize this in you because I'm this way. So that's why I'm asking the question. You strike me as somebody who is a creator of space for people. It's very important for you to gather people together. And you've done that your whole life. So where did that come from? And is the end goal that, or is it this awareness of the soulful awareness for younger people? And, or is it also an awareness about the environment, or is all of that connected? Like as a kid, were you like, were you always the person who got everybody together, and it was really important for you to have lived and shared experiences with your peers? Like, where did that come from in you?
God knows that's, I had to go to my son, the psychiatrist, for an answer to that one. But I do know this. Come that time when I'd been in school, and Susie and I'd been in school from 1965 to 1970, when we graduated from high school at Parkside, to 1971 when I was 70, when I had been in school for 6 years or thereabouts, and Susie and I had been taking turns. And at this point, we were now 24, 25 years old. And Susan and I sat down and had the talk, which is one of many of the talks. And she asked me, well, what do you want to do for a living? Because I'm not going to support you all of our lives. She didn't say that part. She never would. And I said, well, it's pretty obvious to me at this point that I either want to be a teacher or a preacher. And she said to me, well, John, she said, if you want to be a preacher, you probably ought to believe in God. And I said, oh, I guess I better be a teacher. But that answers your question, because even at that point, when I had finally matured enough to know what I want to achieve as a person of worth in society, I knew I wanted to impact the ethos of the people around me. I wanted to bring them inside, I would argue, inside a worldview that cares for other people. Mm-hmm. And I saw the ministry or teaching as those two best avenues for me. I'm not saying they're the only avenues. I'm just saying, for me, given my strengths and my personality, those were the two areas I might be able to be more successful. So that kind of answers your question. I mean, that was there at that point, and it certainly had been there early on. And I can think of episodes early in my life when I was acting as teacherly, and my siblings did not appreciate it. But from there on, it was a pretty straight shot. And it's only my appreciation for wilderness was, and the West was only developing coincidentally, because I'd never been West until Susie insisted on taking me West one year, because she'd been West. She thought I might like it. I've always wondered if she always regretted ever taking me west of the Mississippi the first time, because I never turned back. But even in 69, 70, when we first came west and then started coming west every year, even from North Carolina or Kansas or wherever we were at the time, it grew. It grew from that. And then with the Packers, it became etched, as a part of my, as I say, the inside of my skull. It's in there. I can read it anytime I want. So I speak figuratively a lot.
So I'm going to give you permission to tell a story, but it's going to be one story. Okay. Try to make it as succinct as you can. But what is one of your absolute favorite memories, places you go back to time and time again? Who were you with? You know, what is that one Jacktown story that you draw strength from, or humor, or just gives you the warm fuzzies all over?
Well, as you started out by saying, I would have to run past probably not exaggeration, a million stories to answer completely. So you asked for one. I'm going to focus on one, but you're going to have to let me go just a little bit further than that. The one I'm going to focus on is the first climb on San Luis. San Luis is not my favorite mountain. It's just a molehill. It's a 14,000-foot molehill, but it's still a molehill. And yet, there was that free day. We had the very first trip. We're trial and erroring this whole thing the first time out. And we'd written a free day in it. It was a 4.5-mile backpack up Stewart Creek underneath San Luis. For those of you who don't know San Luis, the later trips don't. And I don't like free days. I 10 minutes into camp, I'm stir crazy. I want to go do stuff. I want to move. I want to see things. I want to see what's over the next, to use the classic line, I want to see what's over the next ridge. Well, over the next ridge was San Luis. And so about 10 of us, Jim and Julie and half dozen, 8 others, Gary, I think. So I said, who wants to go and see what's over the next ridge with me? And 9 of the 35 packers, 25 who were kind of altitude sick or tired of it or just wanted to lie around in camp or whatever. But 10 of us started walking. And somehow we ended up on top of San Luis Peak. And from that day forth, I believe there was always a mountaintop on a Jacktown Packers, including some of the biggest ones, Compagre and Blanca and so on, and some of my favorites, Wetterhorn and Eolus. But what makes that, it's not the biggest mountain, but what makes that the most important moment for me is not only that it led to more mountains, it's also that every time I think of going back to the mountains, it always starts with San Luis. And so I've gone back there with, as I've mentioned in the Zoom sessions, I've gone back there with Henry Toll's ashes. He asked me to put them on top of a mountain. So there they went. I went back there with Glenn Malone, Stephen Malone's ashes. They're on top of the mountain. When I think of going back with Rich Fisher and a few of the other packers, I say, can we start at San Luis? And partly because that, for the physical reason of it's a relatively easy peak, and maybe I can be strong enough to get to the top again. But partly because that's where the mountains start with me. I think that's a nice little essay I just wrote for you. You know, it's I think it's what you're asking for. But I could tell 100 other stories right here now today that would. I mean, I don't remember these things as well as Al does. Whenever I have to remember something, I call Al and say, "Did this happen? When did this happen?" But I have stories. I just can't remember what year they were. Yellowstone stories, Grand Canyon stories, and Wind River stories, and Escalante stories, and
Yeah. Well, that's why we have an archive now, so it's all documented. So
thank you, Lisa.
So if you could go back and talk to your younger self, who's a young whippersnapper on this trip, who had this crazy idea to take kids out west on a school bus for 3 weeks.
I was 30.
Oh, what would you tell your 30-year-old self? Anything, just anything about that would have helped him during that time?
I'm sure there are details that I might change, but I honestly don't know what I could have done to improve it. I really don't think I would change anything significant. If I could do it all over again, which is similar to what you're asking,
yeah,
I would love to be able to do it all over again, and I would not change much. It'd be a little more polished the first year. I would not. take people to the top of Bennett Peak on 13,800 feet or whatever it was on the first day in the mountains and have them puke their guts all over the side of the mountain. I probably wouldn't do that to them again. But other than the, tiny little stuff like who cares about puke on the mountain? That's not important compared to important things. I wouldn't change much. And I have a gut feeling that if you could ask Henry, or when you ask Amy or Mark or whomever, I'd love to hear their answers of what I should have done differently.
I will ask. We'll see what they come up with.
I want to see. I'm looking forward to that one.
So I've seen a lot of photos of you recently of packers who have come to visit you. So what has those lifelong connections meant to you, and what does the reunion mean to you? What are you looking forward to?
It goes back to an earlier question you asked. Surprisingly, I look at my life as having been mostly a loner. I don't like being alone. But when I was a kid, I was the, for those of you who know Napoleon back in the 50s and 60s, it was not a good place for intellectuals. It was not a good place for people who wanted to be smart. Okay. And you look at me today, I have 2 friends in this whole county. I'm alone. Susie's got Alzheimer's. I'm glad she's here, and I want her to be here, but it's not this level of conversation anymore. Okay. So that part of me I wanted to clarify, but I may miss the point of your question, but in terms of what this ongoing relationship I have with all these wonderful people that I've known through most of my life, but particularly with the Jacktown Packers. Man, they don't know how much I hope I'm not too dependent on them. I hope I'm not too needy, to use another phrase, for that. But my social life is the Facebook messaging. It's pathetic, isn't it? But it is, And I don't know if it'll always be that way. It's not my dream. I had a brief Facebook conversation with a good friend in Utah this morning who has traveled in the West with me and done some marvelous things in the West with me, and Alaska. And but he's also a Europe traveler, and he posted a picture of Mona Lisa, and I talked to him about a Leonardo right around the corner from the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, and he said he wished he'd been able to travel in Europe with me. And I said, hey, there's plenty of time. We can still do these things, and that's kind of what those people mean to me. We are still doing that. We're still social, and I'm still hoping that a couple dozen of us get together at the base of San Luis and do whatever we feel like doing. And I think, Jeanette may show up, and Jim, and who knows, maybe Amy and Mark and Ellen and a few other people, and maybe we'll all get together and do these things again someday to the extent that we're able.
Yeah, you actually
did I answer that question? Was that the question you were asking? I can't remember the question. Did I answer it?
Yeah.
Never know.
So you kind of already answered it, but a little bit further than that, is there somebody in particular you're looking forward to seeing at the reunion that you haven't maybe seen in a long time? Maybe you're just friends with them on Facebook. Is there anybody in particular that maybe we can get them there if you give a shout out?
Well, I think I mentioned Rod Shealy to you in our pre-interview conversation. I miss Rod. I mean, he's disappeared. We know his relatives. They're members of the group. I don't know where Rod's gone.
Yeah.
But you may have also inferred this from what I've been saying. Many of the people I've been closest to in the Packers, Carolyn and John Kinch and Amy, and I could list off 50 of those, Jim and Jeanette. I've seen them. I don't see them every year. I don't see them maybe in 10 years, but I've seen them, and Debbie this summer, and Elena, as you know, and the other ones you guys aren't going to be helping with. I'd love to see Henry Toll at the He probably ain't going to be there. You know, he'll be there somehow, but he's not going to be there. You know, and Stephen Malone especially. I miss those two guys to the end of there. Sally will be there. You know, Sally's great. I'm looking forward to that. But I've seen Sally just in the last year or so.
Yeah.
Most of the people who are, and Steve Malone and Henry, we would get together virtually every year. We get together and do something, whether it was hiking or so on with Stephen, or traveling with Henry in Europe, or to Alaska. We did those things. We didn't stop doing them. Mm-hmm. And then Al, of course, Al and I get together every week. You know, we're in constant communication, constant contact. And he didn't want to go to Europe with me. I could never talk him into it, but Alaska and the John Muir Trail and the Sierras, and God, I mean, Al and I played golf courses all over the place, and you know, so that's the kind of question. I don't think I'm digressing at all. I think I'm actually answering your question.
Yeah. So
by the way, folks, the reason I keep mentioning the word digressing is she told me not to digress, so I haven't.
No, you've done a very tight interview. This is great. So last question for you. So what do you want your legacy to be?
I think of this now for what to put on my tombstone out there in Moscow Cemetery out there on the county line. And I think about it more with Susie. And you can't really write whole books. But, you know, my legacy is what I think most people should have as a legacy. Because the Jacktown Packers are gone. I mean, the Packers as the institution is gone. The Packers themselves are still around. And that's really the answer to your question. The question is not the Jacktown Packers as an institution. The question is the Jacktown Packers as people, as individuals, and my sons, and my other students, my Europe trip students, and my academic decathlon students. I hope my legacy is, to a large extent, that the mission statement that you asked about, that was somehow talked about in my mission statement, doesn't end, that it keeps on going beyond me, you know, and then beyond you and your generation, and beyond. Hopefully a lot of you Packers have also created a human legacy. I couldn't wish anything greater on anybody than that. So, Lisa's doing it right now. She does it. What she's doing. She's helping that to happen. I have another comment to make to Lisa. You told me that I had to keep myself within 5 minutes. If we didn't stay within 5 minutes, it's not my fault.
No, you did great. Thank
and you can edit that out if you want.
No, it's good because everybody else is going to get the same spiel from me. So good. That's good. So, well, thank you, John Mark Krenkel. This was fantastic. I hope you all enjoy listening to this interview, which is the first of hopefully many that we have. And I'm just so honored to be a part of this. And in large part, thanks to you. So thank you. All right. Signing off.